anti-Islamic eco-fascism. And if you study the literature as I've done, you don't think it's surprising that the guy in Christchurch who shot 49 Muslims in the mosque writes a big tractate manifesto explaining why he did it, because he's a green. He thinks it's great to shoot Muslims because they're evil, and to protect Mother Earth we have to shoot them all. I mean, how demented and what a travesty of intellectual poverty that we've come to that, you know, position, which is unauthentic in terms of genuine green thinking, which is about holism, about interdimensionality, about ecology, and about respecting all the different religions of humanity as temporal manifestations from the different ecological areas where they arise. As Montesquieu said a long time ago in his classic The Spirit of the Laws, he said each culture has its legal traditions arising from its geography. You know, the Arabs have a particular kind of way of looking at life because of the desert culture that they grew up in. The Tibetan Buddhists have another because they grew up in the Himalayas. The Romans had one because of the Tiber and so on. So that Montesquieu is one of the classic liberal thinkers whose breadth of knowledge then infuses a degree of tolerance, which is what we need. How do you get across ideas like that to people like that shooter, you know? What's gone wrong with our education system? Well, it's been dumbed down in Australia, in Britain, in New Zealand. I've had complaints the New Zealand education system is dumbed down so level to a ridiculous degree. New Zealanders have to bring their kids to England to be educated. I mean, it's all very nice, and you learn to be nice, but you don't actually learn any actual real stuff. Well, I've been a teacher for many years, and that's, you know, I'm still a teacher. I'm passionate about about reawakening the knowledge quotient of my culture, Britain, Europe, Canada, the world. And, you know, I've travelled in 35 countries. I'll carry on with this until I, you know, till I have to relocate to heaven and carry on from the Heavenly Library. I want to move on now, talking of heaven, because today is May the 19th. And it's a sacred day for me, as it should be for all Christians and all seekers of wisdom, because today is the day of St Dunstan, who died on this day, bless him. Now, Dunstan was a very interesting character, great Christian saint. I'm celebrating his life today. He was living from 909 to 988 in English history. He was an Anglo-Saxon, and he was born at a place called Boltonsborough, which was very near to Glastonbury in Somerset, which is a town that I know and love well. And he was educated at Glastonbury. He then joined the household of his uncle, Othelm, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was from the aristocratic wing of Anglo-Saxon society. And then he served for a time at the court of King Athelstan. Now, in 935, he ends up back in Glastonbury, and he's accused of studying the vain poems and futile stories of the pagans and of being a magician. And he was expelled from court. Now, I love this thing about Dunstan because I totally recognise it. Like, anybody who doesn't study pagan philosophy and the poems of the classics and who doesn't study magic is brain dead, really. I mean, this is my point about, yes, it's great that all these esoteric warriors want to study the occult. The trouble is they haven't studied it enough, you know, and they've stopped at let's all be warriors. They've stopped where that shooter is, the guy in New Zealand. They haven't gone on to realising that the imam, the priest, the druid, the seer, the St Dunstan, we all advocate peace. And these are the guys we should be emulating. Anyway, Dunstan, I love it. Accused of being a magician, expelled from court. He thought about getting married. He was probably in love, you know, and enjoying sexuality and whatever, like any human being. But he decided not to. And instead he became a hermit. And he undertook private monastic vows and was ordained as a priest by the Bishop of Winchester on the same day as his friend Ethelwold. The priest in Winchester was called Elphege. I've been, you know, I know this part of the world very well, Wessex, right? It's my other stomping ground. I taught at Caen in the heart of it, and St Dunstan had links to to Caen, which is a beautiful little town with a wonderful girls' school, St Mary's, which I taught philosophy at. So anyway, then he goes back to Glastonbury and he lives as a hermit. And you can just see him, sort of New Age hermit, practicing the crafts of painting, embroidery, metalwork, goldsmithing, writing poetry, etc. Like so many people in Glastonbury today, Glastonbury is still a spiritual heartland for Wessex and English culture and should be rising up against the narrowness of the stupid Farage, Brexit, semi-educated people. Anyway, he had a stroke of fortune because in 939 Edmund, who was a friend, became King of Wessex and recalled him to court, and then installed him as Abbot of Glastonbury. So, from being like an outskirt on a hermit living in, up on, I don't know, the Tor or somewhere, he was made abbot of this amazing ancient monastery, which had a wonderful library. It had been founded by wandering Irish monks, or by Joseph of Arimathea, as tradition said. I would give anything that the library of Glastonbury had not been destroyed. It was one of the worst crimes of Thomas Cromwell. I totally disagree with Hilary Mantel's kind of whitewashing of Thomas Cromwell. He was a nasty piece of work. He tortured the abbot of Glastonbury, who was loyal to his Catholic roots. And poor man died, and the library was destroyed. It was all just burned or scattered. Poor old John Dee nearly went mad trying to retrieve everything that had been lost. And that's why our culture is so dumbed down, because of this destruction of knowledge that has happened. The Thomas Cromwell was the kind of, the Brexit guy of his day, without scruples, without ethics, and without conscience. Anyway, Dunstan was a whole different kettle of fish. He was a very good abbot in Glastonbury, and it was a time of terrible chaos, Danish invasions, and he restored the rule of St Benedict to the abbey, and in 940. Now, I've been to Monte Cassino, where St Benedict was from, one of the great sanctuaries of Christendom, which, interestingly enough, was originally a temple to Apollo. On that amazing mountain. It's like the Magic Mountain in Thomas Mann's novel. Go to Monte Cassino if you ever get a chance. If you do one thing in your life, go there. It's not far from Naples, and it's midway between Naples and Rome. And there's a tremendous museum, and it was all destroyed by the World War II, but then rebuilt by the Italian people. And Benedict has been declared patron saint of Europe, which is quite right. He was a great man. Learned in pagan philosophy and very deep thinker, and also in all aspects of Christian scholarship and theology. He knew the Bible inside out, along with his sister, Saint Scholastica, who was also a great woman. Anyway, dear old Dunstan knew all this. He studied them. He was in that tradition. And the next king, Edred, was so impressed by him that he even kept some of the royal treasure at Glastonbury. And he left £200 in the king's will for the people of Somerset and Devon. And Edred the king, like Edmund, was buried in Glastonbury with rites conducted by Dunstan. Then, of course, another king comes in, a chap called Edwy, who is against all this learning. We don't want that. And actually exiled Dunstan to Europe. Europe is the refuge for all people chased out of England for thinking too much, like happened to... at the time of Henry II, when he clashed with Thomas of Canterbury. And so dear old Dunstan took refuge at Mont Blanc in Ghent, and he saw what was going on in Europe. These were advanced thinkers. This was an advanced civilization. Ghent, Belgium, Antwerp, the rich monasteries there with incredible libraries. Like, if you're a scholar like Dunstan, these things are to die for. And the irony is a lot of them had been founded by wandering Irish monks who brought these books from Ireland and saved European culture from its own self-destruction at the hands of the Vikings. Everyone loves a Viking, but they were a bit semi-educated and they had no respect for books. They burned half the books of Ireland. As Joyce says in his classic History of Ireland, he points out these wandering Viking tribes, virtually destroyed all the great monasteries and libraries of Ireland. It's a catastrophe that one is still recovering from. Fortunately, a lot of the books were brought to Europe and survived here in monasteries like Bobbio and others that were founded by wandering Irish clerics around this time. Glastonbury was, one that they received books from the Irish. The Irish were highly literate, unbelievably learned people, because they'd all been Druids, right, before, so what do you expect? Anyway, he hangs around in Europe for a while, and he learns everything he can here. And he's so impressed. Then he's recalled by King Edgar, who's the next king. I mean, this guy sees off loads of monarchs, right? And he makes him first Bishop of Worcester, which is a city I know and love well. I've spent many times in the cathedral there. My youngest daughter was born in Worcester. I love Worcester. And in the crypt you find St Wulfstan, who was the last Anglo-Saxon bishop left standing after the Norman Conquest. A great saint in his own right. Anyway, Dunstan was there for a while. And then he was made Bishop of London, which is, amazing, really. And this is just a hermit who'd been living up on the Tor, right? Kind of, sort of a proto-hippie chap. And then in 960, he's made Archbishop of Canterbury, which is like the head of the Church of England. So what an amazing guy, right? And we celebrate his death today. He stimulated education throughout the land. He reformed the abbeys of Glastonbury, Malmesbury, Bath. I know Bath Abbey well. Athelney, Muchelney, and Westminster as well. Westminster Abbey, right? And he wrote the coronation service for the kings. I mean, he's lived through all these different monarchs. As Archbishop of Canterbury, it's his job to crown them. And he wrote the service, which is still in use, and that's the one that crowned Elizabeth and will crown her successor Charles. And it's a beautiful document. I mean, obviously it's been upgraded. He wrote it in Old Anglo-Saxon. But the fundamental thing is that the monarch has to swear to preserve the frith, the peace of the people. The fundamental oath that a monarch takes when they become the king or queen of England and now the United Kingdom is to preserve and protect the peace of the realm. That's why in law the Queen's peace is the thing that you can be done for if you disturb that. Now I think these Brexit mobs should be done for disturbing the Queen's peace. They're destroying her kingdom and her queendom. And it's utterly scandalous. These Farage types, these little neo-fascists, are actually breaking the law. They're disturbing the Queen's peace. There's another very telling and tragic thing about Farage's mentality, if you can call it that. Prince Charles went to address the European Parliament. He's an intelligent man. I have met Prince Charles. He's a clever man and a good man. I know he's made some mistakes and he didn't marry well, and it's very sad. But we have to forgive him now. We're all human, right? And he means well. He's an intellectual, is dear old Charles, and a spiritual intellectual. He realises, to be head of the church one day is not a small thing. So anyway, he went to the European Parliament. He gave an impassioned speech about the environment, about protecting nature and so on. His big thing is love for nature, which is, I share it. Not to the point of eco-extremism, but to the point of eco-wisdom, like Charles. And Nigel Farage was in the Parliament, and he refused to stand up. He sat there sulkily and rudely, deliberately making a political point that he didn't agree with what Charles was saying. Of all the MEPs in Parliament, in the European Parliament, this little man, Nigel Farage, was the one that had to insult our future king. That tells you where he's at. He's a little Goebbels. And he's been that for a long time. I mean, I'm surprised. I think there should be some kind of rule in the European Parliament that if you bring the institution into disrepute, you're not allowed to be an MP there. And if you campaign to have the institution destroyed, which is what he's been doing, he should be sacked. I mean, how can you... It's like having a guest at the party who's constantly trashing the living room. You throw them out. There should be some legislation brought in that you can't be an MEP unless you tell the truth, but also live the truth. You can't seek to destroy the very institution that you've been elected to. it makes no sense. I think Europeans have been too kind to Nigel Farage by tolerating him. Anyway, back to Dunstan. He did lots of reforms. He encouraged the arts and education, and he did justice. He had to give legal hearings and so on. And then he was also a teacher, and he was a scholar. He corrected manuscripts. And gradually, even during his lifetime, all kinds of stories and visions, prophecies and miracles were attributed to him. And he died on this day, 19th of May, aged nearly 80, in 988. And he's one of the greatest saints that England ever produced, really. He's known as the patron saint of magicians and alchemists and esotericists, and he was reputed to have succeeded in the alchemical work of making gold. Well, I would say personally that's just a blind, for he was a very good teacher, because a good teacher transforms the pupil or student into pure gold. And that's why I bother with my education. I'm in the Dunstan tradition. Where I grew up in Brighton, we had a place called St Dunstan's along the cliff, which is where blind people went. I think it's a charity still going. Again, he's the patron saint of the blind, because although they've lost their sight, blind people are still very wise and often become much wiser because they lose the visual, titillations, so they focus on what's really important. Anyway, so there's St Dunstan. I want to honour him today, and there's a book on alchemy called On the Philosopher's Stone, which some people say he wrote and other people disagree. He was certainly someone interested in these things, and a great thinker. I want to also mention just one thing, since we're on the subject of abbeys and Prince Charles. Some years ago now, I had a dream. I was in Wessex in Lulworth, and I had this amazing dream, actually, that I was presenting a scroll to Prince Charles. I'd met him a few years before that, and it was handwritten on vellum, and it was beautifully done with calligraphy. And what this scroll proposed was that when he becomes king, he should have all the abbeys and ruined monasteries of Britain rebuilt that were pulled down by his distant ancestor and pillaged and racked and ruined. They should be rebuilt tastefully, a bit like Notre Dame is going to be rebuilt, with glass with the stone. The roof could be a glass roof. I'm hoping they'll do something visionary like that. Well, so we could do something like that with the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey and establish them again, but not this time as kind of, full-on abbeys, but loosely under the Church of England in a very ecumenical spirit. They'd be spiritual pilgrimage centres. So people who are searching for truth, for peace, for sanctuary, for wisdom, could go and spend, a day, a night, 3 days, a week, a month there. Have to contribute to the life of the community by some work, but also some study. And everyone would have a good library equipped. And they would be producing arts and handicrafts and things. And the men and women might be in different wings. You'd have to be celibate, I think, unless you were like a married couple. Like a normal kind of Anglican retreat centre, like the one on the beautiful one on Iona, which I've been to. So anyway, that's my vision. That's what the charter said, and I presented it to Charles, and he really liked the idea. He said, "Okay, when I'm king, remind me." Anyway, I woke up from that dream with tears coming out my face, thinking, "What a beautiful dream!" And then I thought, this is such a good dream, I have to share this. So I got a friend of mine who was an expert calligrapher to draw out in fine writing exactly what I'd seen in the dream, and we sent it to Prince Charles in the post. And lo and behold, a couple of months later, he wrote back a very kind letter saying, "Thank you, Thomas, for your beautiful gift, scroll, and it's a very nice idea, very touching." He didn't commit to either doing it or not doing it. He's too diplomatic for that. But I think the idea was lodged. You see, Charles loves the old abbeys. He loves the architectural wisdom of these places that were often built at sacred sites and That's why he founded the Prince of Wales Institute of Architecture. He's interested in sacred architecture. He worked with Keith Critchlow and others to found that centre. And he wants to preserve the ancient craft skills of Britain. My daughter's done, training. He set up this Prince of Wales Trust, which works to help young people that are unemployed or don't have skills and so on to find a path in life. Well, can you imagine if we rebuilt, say, 100 of these great abbeys in England and Wales and elsewhere, places like Strata, Florida, and all of them? It would give employment to local people, it would stimulate the crafts again, and it would give a haven for scholars like me when we come back to England to visit, and there'd be lecture rooms and all the rest of it. And the ancient Druid wisdom that I believe is so important is also buried in these places, in Glastonbury and in Strata, Florida, and all the other magical spots around England. Anyway, that is my final coda to what I was saying about Dunstan. So, thank you, Dunstan, for all you did, and we're going to try and rebuild them all. And let's re-establish a bit of civility in our land, Now I want to move on to the third point of this talk, which is, some of you may know, I'm doing a recording on the Quran. I'm doing an in-detailed commentary on the Quran, because as well as a Christian and a student of Christian mysteries and a Druid, I'm also a Sufi, and I've studied the Quran for years and taught it. And I've studied Islamic history in great detail. I used to teach at the Muslim College, which is the most important centre for Islamic studies in Britain, under Dr. Zaki Badawi, who was a good friend of mine and a great scholar, and also a friend of Prince Charles, actually. So the Quran is a book that I know and love dearly, but it's never properly understood or commented on or translated. And there's been this huge misunderstanding, both within the Islamic world and outside the Islamic world, people looking at Islam. People have come to hate Islam. There are people that detest it and want to go and shoot people in mosques. That's just so ridiculous. But on the other hand, there are also Muslims that, hate the West and want to shoot people in the West. So it's a front line of real conflict. And this is true in the Balkan Wars, in Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. These people were fighting literally to the death in my lifetime, on my watch. And I've known people from all over the Balkans and all over the Middle East as my students and friends. And that's why I've got into the Quran in such detail, because my argument is that if we can find the secret meanings behind the Quran, if we can get the true hermeneutic going, which means the interpretative framework for a text like the Quran or the Bible or whatever, then that can be a bridge. We can make peace. Okay, so this is part of my peace scholar thing. And I was commenting earlier today on a couple of very important verses which I wanted to share with you because, I think they're relevant. Now this is, obviously I've gone into enormous detail in this in my proper commentary on the Quran, which is available on my Green University website. And you can listen to it at your heart's content. I'm just going to summarise what I was saying. And it's in Surah 2, in verses 213, and I'm also going to comment on probably up to 216. So this is a surah that was revealed in Medina. So Muhammad's left Mecca, he's fled, he's got out with his life, and those of his companions, Ali and so on. And they're re-establishing a community in Medina of people that just want to really study and find God. They're looking for ultimate truth, like, aren't we all? Like Dunstan was, in Glastonbury, studying magic, right? Which is the word for esoteric wisdom, by the way, the science of the magus. And so, what the Quran is saying, and obviously Muhammad must have studied this stuff in great detail. In my commentary, I've gone into the likely influences on Muhammad. Muhammad was a trader. He wandered around Syria. I think he also went to Hira, which was the trading city on the northeast of the Arabian Peninsula, on the borders going up to Iran, which was full of really interesting people, Zoroastrians, pagans, and Manichaeans even, Gnostic Christians. All of this Muhammad soaked in, and it kind of festered away, And he'd been influenced by his wife, Khadija, who he loved very deeply, who was a kind of a Gnostic Christian as well, and her cousin, Waraka. There was a whole circle of esoteric thinkers around in Mecca and Arabia at that time. It wasn't a cut-off dead zone. It was, a bit like California in the 1960s. It was a haven of new thinking. It was sort of on the fringe. But the fringes are often where most exciting things happen, as happened later in Andalusia, which was the confluence of Jewish, Christian and Islamic currents, gave us a miracle of Andalusian synthesis. So, anyway, Muhammad is bubbling away, and this is what comes out. You see, the Quranic verses come from that highest wisdom place. We all have it. We just don't access it most of the time. We don't listen to it. We don't cultivate it. It's the Gnostic, irfan place, to use the Arabic term of higher gnosis or wisdom. When our soul sort of touches God, and in deep prayer and meditation, that's the place we reach. I mean, Quakers. I started my spiritual life with the Quakers, really, and Buddhists and practicing meditation and so on. But that's the point of Quaker meeting. That's why we go there and meditate in silence and peace. Anyway, this is what Muhammad was able to download from that place of higher wisdom. And it's obviously in translation. Mankind was one single nation, and God sent messengers with glad tidings and warnings. And with them he sent the book in truth, to judge between people in matters wherever they differed. Okay, so this is the context in which Muhammad saw his mission. Like, every tribe, every nation throughout all of history has had its prophets and seers and sages. There's a constant stream of them. And most of their names are countless unknowns. We don't know the names of all these sages. If you think back, mankind has been speaking intellectually, rationally, intelligently for about 100,000 years at least. I've just watched a film in French of scientists, anthropologists at the universities here in France. They've been able to reconstruct the vocal, apparatuses of early man. And yes, at least 100,000. Actually, they're putting it further back than that now. So the people of the cave paintings of the Dordogne and Pyrenees here in France, 20,000, 30,000 BC, they were speaking. They had as sophisticated a communication system as any tribe alive now. And they would have had their shamans, their elders, their druids, their seers, men and women who were able to do this kind of download thing with the ultimate. They would have had totally different languages and cosmologies. They would have had a pantheon of deities, some of them animal-type deities, archetypes, because why is it the Quran talks about just the one God and these other religions talk about many? Because the paradox is the many is the one, and the one is the many. Plato pointed out, the great philosopher, that the one, tohen in Greek, then manifests as the many. It's not like you can only have one and not the many. The minute you have oneness, you have posited, logically, manyness. And the minute you have manyness, you have posited oneness. So the two exist in a dialectical tension of co-creativity, and that's the world, that's where we live, right? And some thinkers emphasize the one, some thinkers emphasize more the many. Muhammad emphasized more the one, but he doesn't deny the many. And here is one of the most important verses. He says, look, every tribe has had its prophets. And this is a theme that recurs in the Quran. It's said many, many times. And each prophet brought with them an aspect to the message, the teachings about truth. And they vary. Obviously, they come in the language that the people of that day and age can make sense of. There's no point, I don't know what they spoke in the Dordogne 30,000 BC, some very obscure old ancient language, but there's no point me speaking in that language now. Nobody would understand it, so I have to use English. And the same with all teachers. They have to speak in a language that's understood. Why? So that people can judge in the matters wherein they differ. That's very, very important verse, because what it's saying is that that book, the criterion, it's known as the Furqan in Arabic, the book within the book within the book. So the mother of all the Qurans, the al-Kitab, as it's said in Arabic, the mother of all the Qurans, is universal. It's applicable to all cultures, all times, all places, and all prophetic lineages, right? So that can judge between, say, the Americans wanting to bomb Iran, or the Israelis wanting to bash more Palestinians, or the Palestinians wanting to bash more Israelis, or, you know, etc., and. All these religious wars and nonsense that are going down. The mother of all the books is the criteria of judgment as to right and wrong between them. The very thing that, you know, the Islamophobes are terrified of is actually the thing that can help us all get peace on this planet. But the peoples of the book, after the clear signs came to them, did not differ among themselves except through selfishness and contumacy. So they fell out with each other in their, like, my book's better than yours, my Revelation, my Torah, my Talmud, my Gospels, my Catholic Gospels, no, my Protestant Gospels, no, my Gnostic Gospels, no, my Shiism, no, my Sunnism, no, my Ishmaelism, you know, no, my Druze, no, my Baha'i, you know, etc., etc. So this is what it's talking about, that all the tribes of man, unfortunately, give them a bit of revelation and they start making sects of it. And they then set each other up as, you know, I'm the bigwig of this sect and I don't recognise you. That's what the Catholic Church is supposed to not do. That's what Dunstan was trying not to do. As Archbishop of Canterbury, his job was to say, look, let's be one people here. Let's have one wisdom that we can all share. That's what Prince Charles is one day going to have to bear the burden of, holding up that Catholicity. In spite of all the manyness of British culture, we are ultimately one people. And, you know, that's the message that's here in this sacred book. So, God, by his grace, guided the believers to the truth. Now this is, again, you know, you need to go into each word really, but the grace of God is very important. That's baraka in Arabic. Grace, gratia, means gratitude in Latin. Grace comes to us when we're grateful. I'm only able to teach because I'm so grateful for the learning I've received. I've been taught by some of the most amazing people on this planet. I've sat at the feet of great Sufis and sages of all Sunnah, Shia and other traditions. I've sat at the feet of Catholic bishops and academics and intellectuals and so on. I'm so grateful to them that my job is to share that in return, because most of these people are dead now. And when, you know, and so I have a duty to in turn hand this on. Now I hope that gratitude itself is the transference of grace, and then ultimately we're guided to the truth. That's what it seems to work out, as far as I can tell. You know, the more you look into stuff, the more you find out. Christ put it beautifully, he said, knock and you will find, seek and you will discover. He was a teacher of a very high order, of a, you know, profound rabbinical wisdom lineage going back to the Enochian writings and the Kabbalah, a universal wisdom teaching, which is the same where Muhammad was coming from, although they had different intellectual you know, formulations of it. It's the same fundamental insight, as it was with all the greatest rabbis like Enoch and